UC Shore Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all and to introduce our lecturer for today, who is currently the Center Fellow in this, during this academic year. And he came to us doing research on Southern Eastern Europe. He is a senior lecturer in modern European history at the School of Historical Studies at the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom. And since 2014, he is the director of the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the same university. Right? He received his PhD at the Department of History at Humboldt University in Germany, and earned his PhD for his thesis with the title Intertwined Genocide, Ustasha Mass Violence in Croatia, 1941-1945. This dissertation won, I think, several prizes. For example, the Wiener Library Frankel Prize in the category A, and also his book, which kind of came out of the dissertation, which was published in German, and also the book received prizes for his research and writing. But this is not the only publication Alexander Korb has. He had published already a volume before he even finished his PhD, which was originally his master thesis, which he did at the Technical University in Berlin, which is also my alma mater. Just saying. And this was a study on the reactions of the German population during the pogrom of November, the so-called Crystal Night. And there he kind of brought together a lot of reports which were previously not kind of available to researchers. And the study is now actually in the second edition, I just saw, so which is always a very important sign that there is a demand for this research. And the same is true for his book on the dissertation, which also came out in the second edition. He published also an edited volume on in a series of about concentration camps, which kind of is a combination of different contributions on politics of mass violence in Nazi Germany. He received several prestigious fellowships from Yad Vashem, the Simon Wiesenthal Institute in Vienna, and also the Imre Kertész College in Jena. And now he is with us and hopes to conduct research for his upcoming book. And he can talk about this much better than I do. So welcome, Alexander Korb.
Thank you both very much for the kind introduction. Jena, Jerusalem, Washington. I'm here now, Center Fellow at the USC Shore Foundation, and I'm very pleased to be here, so thank you for having me here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my research, which is, as a word of warning, a work in progress. The reason why Wolf knows all about my research, namely the MA thesis turned into a book, is the fact that he actually volunteers to read it in Berlin 15 years ago or so, I think. And you see what kind colleague and person Wolf is. He really read my MA thesis voluntarily. Do you remember? Yeah. And in that respect, really helped me greatly to turn that into a good MA thesis, and then later on into a book which it became. But I'm here, of course, today to talk about the Holocaust in southeastern Europe and about collaboration between Germans and non-German perpetrators during the Second World War and the Holocaust, and that's the title of my talk. So I'm going to explore the participation of non-Germans during the Holocaust. And when I was asked to give the talk today, struggling with the mouse, because it's not a mouse, it's a computer, I think. getting there. When I was asked to give my presentation today on April 20, I of course had to chuckle a little bit, because today is Hitler's birthday, and we as Germans of course instantly know April 20, that's kind of a non-go area. And only then I realized that here in the US the date has probably much less of a significance. And there we go, actually what we can study here with that date in a way still being part of the German conscience is how much the everyday impact of these events such as Hitler's birthday on German everyday life was, and that's of course our grandparents' generation here who would still have remembered how it was to have to celebrate or be reminded of Hitler's birthday on a very on an annual basis on April 20. And believe it or not, Germans even named good weather after Hitler. It was called Führerwetter when the sun was shining. So this indeed had an everyday impact. So this is why I also wanted to start with Hitler on the front cover of the Spiegel, kind of the equivalent of the Time magazine in Germany, and the fact that our view on collaboration is still a view or a perspective that's very much from bottom to top shaped of view. So we still imagine that if we talk about non-German perpetrators, and that was in a way the theme of that issue of the Spiegel, we think that we have to do with German puppets or accomplices who in a way perform on the ground what Hitler and his fellow German leaders had in mind in Berlin. And I'm of course going to challenge this perception during my talk today, and this is really on the non-German perspectives and the non-German agendas during the Holocaust and during the Second World War. Of course, it's the state of the art to question this German-centric perspective on collaboration, and we of course know how independent non-German perpetrators partly were in the ground. However, if we look at the popular perception of these non-German perpetrators, we still tend to think of them as German puppets. And also recent scholarships, whether it's Mark Mesauer's Hitler's Empire or Nazi rule in occupied Europe, whether it's the most recent books on Southeastern Europe during the Second World War, Hitler's New Disorder, or whether it's a book on genocide and resistance in Hitler's Bosnia, they all have Hitler in their titles, and they in a way also demonstrate how Hitler-centric research can sometimes be, even though actually there is a little gap here between the titles and the front covers and the content. So these books don't really focus on Hitler that much, but in a way to pay tribute to the English language book market Hitler sells, of course. And in that respect, I think the books are smarter than their titles. However, Hitler was never in his life in Bosnia. He didn't have a great interest in Bosnia, and the people in Bosnia during the Second World War were pretty independent. So violence in Bosnia during the Second World War was shaped by local dynamics to a much greater extent than by what Hitler had in mind with that part of Yugoslavia. So what I'm interested in is really the dynamics between the Germans, local perpetrators, and those who are affected by the actions of both, by Germans and local perpetrators. And this is a picture which I think demonstrates that dynamic very nicely, it's a picture from occupied Poland, which I've been given by my colleague Dieter Paul, which shows a Polish policeman checking the papers of a Jewish victim overseen by 2 German soldiers and watched by Polish civilians who are in a way the bystanders in that picture and represent the society in which all that is happening. We unfortunately don't know much of the details. We don't know the names of those persons, but the picture demonstrates really nicely those dynamics and also spark a huge number of questions which kind of stand symbolically for the research I am carrying out here and in my book project. So the question is, what is actually the language that these people are speaking in that very moment? Do the German soldiers understand a word of the conversation? Is the Jewish person, he's probably answering in Polish? Does the Polish police officer translate each and every sentence to the German soldiers? And if so, does he translate correctly? Does he translate word by word? Or is he actually kind of twisting the sense of the conversation he has with that Jewish worker presenting his papers? I think the leeway of the Polish police officer is a little bit smaller than usual because of all the bystanders. So there is a lot of Polish ears overseeing and listening to that very conversation. But I think we can easily imagine that that those intermediaries between the German occupiers and the Jewish victims do have considerable leeway and very often have an agenda of their own, whether it's a private or a monetary agenda, or whether it's like a political or a nationalistic agenda. Of course, that police officers' behavior shapes the dynamic on the ground. And in some respect, and this is why it's also an interesting picture, it's a rare moment where we actually see those groups, the 3 groups together on one picture, because the usual interaction on an everyday basis would have been between the Jewish victim and the Polish police officer, especially on the countryside where the German military is usually not around or not on a kind of daily basis. So this is a picture from Poland, but I think it stands for many of the societies that were under German occupation or that were under kind of German, were independent and where German troops were around, or even for those countries that were entirely independent during the Second World War. And if we have a look at the map of Europe during World War II, just as a reminder, of course, we have to bear in mind again and again how many of the European countries actually were independent during the Second World War. So we have the independent states of Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and Croatia in the southeastern part of Europe. Even Greece and Serbia had governments of their own during the Second World War, so that there was a Greek prime minister, there was a Serbian prime minister, and then we have other countries such as Finland and of course the Italian Empire with its own protectorates, Montenegro and Albania, a huge range of countries which were nominally independent. And then of course we have many more occupied territories where also on the ground local groups, local perpetrators, local militias enjoy to a certain degree a level of independence, especially if we talk about parts of the Ukraine or Poland. Some of those countries are occupied by the Germans, some of those countries are not occupied by the Germans, such as Bulgaria or Hungary or Finland or Slovakia. The degree of independence varies to a great extent. To some of the countries, the expression of a puppet state, which I actually reject, might be even justified, whereas others were really truly independent countries which could, dictate on their own what's going to happen within their boundaries and whatnot. So, in my talk, in my following talk, I would like to talk about my approach, about collaboration, and have a look in the second part at the non-German agendas and what they looked like and what they were shaped by in wartime Europe. Thirdly, I will have a quick look on the practices on the ground and talk about some of the remarkable cases and why I think it's important to shed light on these non-German wartime histories. And finally, in the fourth point, I will talk about the Jewish perspectives and how they will help us to understand what's going on in Europe during the Second World War. And finally, I will wrap up by stating a few points why I think that this will help shaping our picture of the Holocaust and understanding it in a better way. So, this is the wrong map. Okay, I'll stay here at the map of Europe, which I of course altered a little bit. In black, it's the independent states onto which I will be focusing. The red line is the big important dividing line between Nazi-dominated Europe and the Soviet Union until 1941, and the green spaces are the fascist Italian Empire as well as the French Vichy-controlled space. So we can see that we have a lot of sectors in Europe, and it's not all of Europe is equally dominated by the German Empire in 1941, which is the starting point here for my talk today. So, what I want to explore in talking about collaboration is that we truly talk about a transnational phenomenon that, once again, does not only represent the relations between the Germans on the top, sitting in Berlin or occupying these countries, and local perpetrators in the countries we are talking about, but that it's truly dynamic and transnational relationship in that sense that it's not only about Germans and non-Germans, but that these countries have also relations in between each other, and that it is important to look at the relations, for instance, between Hungary and Romania during the war, or between Croatia and Serbia, in order to understand the dynamics, the tensions on the ground, and also the agendas of these people. Often these states and the nationalist elites running these states are competing against each other, and in that respect I think a transnational history of collaboration is overdue. Secondly, if we talk about collaboration, we of course have to define exactly what level we are talking about, and collaboration takes place at least 4 levels. One is the international level, which has even a global dimension. Many of these states were of course very keen to be recognized as independent states. So when, for instance, Croatia was awarded its independence in 1941, it was extremely important for that country to get international recognition by countries such as Japan or Manchukuo or Thailand. And when, not really embassies, but honorary consulates of those Asian countries opened in those smaller states, that was of major importance for the national self-esteem of countries like, say, Croatia, and there was indeed an international awareness of the international perception of these countries, which was highly important. And again, the attention of these countries was not directed to Berlin alone. Secondly, we have the national level, of course, which I will talk about in a second when talking about the agendas of non-German perpetrators. Thirdly, regional level, which is partly the level that explains the dynamics the dynamics of mass violence, genocide, and ethnic cleansing on the ground. And finally, we have a more local level, a village level, in the communities that are affected by violence, which is much more than only the Holocaust, understood as persecution of the Jews, but which is very often intertwined with acts of local, of ethnic cleansing in those countries. All those levels, all the four levels are of course intertwined, and it would be impossible to study one level alone without also looking at the other levels on the horizontal level, as well as the international competition between these countries. Once again, the traditional perspective on local perpetratorhood and collaboration is extremely misleading, because we've been always thinking that non-German local agendas are either understandable because local perpetrators were German puppets, kind of remote controlled executioners of German agendas on the one hand, or because they were kind of local nationalists out of control, kind of brutal nationalists with knives in their hands who were eager to kill their Jewish neighbors. So we have both pictures, either the one of remote controlled puppets or the one of monsters who got out of control. And both, of course, contradict each other, because either you are out of control or you are remote controlled. But that didn't really matter, because the explanatory power of both images of local perpetrators was so successful, because it allowed us to actually not to study their agendas in greater details. It was a very easy explanation that was very comfortable, because kind of it could shift away the focus from those local societies, which was also a very popular explanation in the countries affected themselves, especially in the post-war years, when most of the guilt regarding what has happened in those societies had been shifted either to the Germans as such, or to a small group, a tiny group of brutalized perpetrators, which could then be explained as crazy / German puppets. And that's of course what happened in so many countries after the Second World War. The background, however, of the conflicts I'm going to address here is the fact that we are talking about an extremely ethnically heterogeneous part of Europe, which is basically, and that's what in a way Donald Bloxham highlighted, and some other authors, such as Omar Bartov, who will be here in 2 weeks' time, which they call shadow zones of the big empires. And part of Europe, the eastern and southeastern parts of Europe, which were shaped by ethnic homogeneity, where ethnic and national boundaries do not match, and where the fact that local nationalist groups want to achieve or want to turn their countries into modern ethnically homogeneous nation states spark so many conflicts across Eastern and Southeastern Europe. So if we look at Romania, if we look at Bulgaria, if we look at the Yugoslav space, all of these countries, of course, are shaped by violent conflicts and ethnic homogenization, which culminate before and during the Second World War, which lead to a lot of minority conflicts in the interwar years, and then where the Second World War is perceived as an opportunity for many non-German nationalists to achieve ethnic homogeneity on the side of the Germans. So for non-German perpetrators, and that's important if we look at their agendas, the Second World War was truly an opportunity where ethnic homogeneity and territorial revisionism could be achieved, and where the alliance with the Germans was seen as a productive step towards more national independence and not less national independence. So I would argue that, of course, if we look at those countries, their regional histories and their geographies have to be taken very seriously, and we need to understand those national projects that started as early as in the 1880s, the creation of ethnically homogenized nation states, and that again culminate in the 1930s and 1940s, where Hitler in a way presents himself as a European broker. Partly he presents himself as a peacemaker who allows those countries to achieve what they want in negotiation with the other countries, and where he in a way promises or opens a dialogue between those countries that that's the promise will lead to a new European order, promising kind of a system of European stability based on ethnic homogeneity. And of course, the what European politicians at the time called the Jewish question, and the solution of the Jewish question is intertwined with those minority questions that are being discussed here in the 1940s, and Jews are only amongst one of several groups national leaders want to either get rid of or want to minimize within their states to be ethnically homogenized. So who are these national leaders we are talking about? And that's, I think, a very important perspective on local perpetratorhood. It's, again, not some brutalized militiamen who yield their knives on the ground, but it's often highly educated academics who either turned into statesmen or who run institutions that are interested in questions of ethnic homogenization and statistics and demographies and local economies. Many of them have their degrees from German universities, others have their degrees from other international universities, and it's again well educated, well connected experts on all kinds of levels who partake in those discourses, which are also well connected with the discourse of what are minorities and what's the European future of minorities. That's, of course, a big field, and I think on the interstate level it's important to study how the discourse rapidly changes once Germany becomes the dominating power within Europe after 1938 at least. However, that would not explain sufficiently what's going on the ground, and this is, I think, the major part of my study, to shed light on a number of countries including including the southeastern part of Europe, as well as those countries where local conflicts during the Second World War bring these levels together. So let me give you two examples. Number one is Romania, a country where the Holocaust is shaped by a dynamic that is absolutely independent of the genocide, or of the final solution of the Jewish question as it was shaped by the Germans. The Holocaust in Croatia starts as early as 1940, when in the town of Dorohoj, in July of 1940, a pogrom breaks out where 53 Jews are being killed by Romanian militiamen. And the Holocaust in Romania is a case of mass violence where German perpetrators on the ground are basically not involved. They are only involved as observers in Bessarabia, but it's a genocide that is perpetrated by Romanian perpetrators alone, and which again is directed not only against Romanian Jews, but as well against Slavs, as well as Gypsies in Romania, who are deported from Romania proper into Bessarabia and Transnistria. The second case study, of course, is the state of Croatia, which I've studied in great length already in my last book, which is nevertheless to be included into that comparative study. The fascist government of the independent state of Croatia, the Ustaša government, sets out to create an ethnically homogeneous state, the independent state of Croatia, during the Second World War. And they agree with the Germans that they can use, or that they are allowed to expel up to 300,000 Serbs from Croatia into other areas, into Serbia, as well as into other neighboring countries during the war. And that case of ethnic cleansing does not only unleash a civil war on the ground, because once those militiamen start cleansing mixed and Serbian villages and to deport Serbs into neighboring countries, it does not only spark a lot of local resistance, but it also radicalizes those Croatian perpetrators take on the Jewish minority within the country once they have the opportunity to arrest non-Croats in great numbers, and once they create an infrastructure that is necessary for putting such a persecution into practice. We are talking about the chain of institutions that is needed to make ethnic cleansing happen. In other words, state institutions that take care of the assets of the deportees, a system that or they come up with a system that allows to not only ethnically homogenize the villages affected, but also to socially engineer, in other words, to improve the social infrastructure of the villages that are affected by ethnic cleansing. And once, and of course most importantly, the concentration and transit camps into which the deportees are to be brought. And once that whole infrastructure is in place, it's remarkable how quickly the persecution of the Jews as well as of the Roma within Croatia radicalizes as well. So the principal take was directed against Serbs, but once the idea that the country could be ethnically cleansed is unleashed, it soon starts spreading and affecting other minorities as well. And that's a very typical picture if we look at if we look at the countries where the persecution of Jews is intertwined with the persecution of other groups. Secondly, that leads to civil wars in a number of countries because the population of those areas to be ethnically cleansed, whether it's Serbs in Croatia or whether it's Poles in Volhynia and in eastern Ukraine, a region right here, or whether it's the Slavic population of Bessarabia here. So the population in many of those ethnically mixed borderlands is, of course, or the attempt to cleanse those ethnically mixed borderlands, of course, sparks a lot of resistance, especially in regions where partisan activities are already underway. So the result are local civil wars. And so here an approach becomes relevant that has been featured by Christian Gerlach, who speaks about coalitions of perpetrators that are interested in pursuing extremely or that are acting within extremely violent societies in order to pursue their goals. So it's important to highlight that the interest of the groups of perpetrators do differ. They don't have automatically a consensus why it would be important to persecute certain groups of victims. The important part is that they agree on certain goals with well, different motives in the background. So and once local conflicts turn violent, of course, the victims in a way, or the violent approach of the perpetrators, of a variety of groups of perpetrators, leads to the fact that forms or coalitions of various victim groups could be formed as well, and we can observe that in a number of societies affected by extreme violence, whether it's Greece, whether it's Bessarabia, whether it's Croatia, or whether it's Eastern Poland, Western Ukraine, that actually persecuted Jews and Poles here in that region, or Jews and Serbs in the region here, or Jews and Slavs in the region in Bessarabia here, are in a way forced into a coalition of victimhood, and I would like to give you an example, which was the first, in a way, case study I came up here with using the Visual History Archive, which was quite an exciting observation. It was the village of Hanachów in Volhynia in eastern Poland. So this is a village that was part of the Polish Republic until 1939, and which became part of a civil war in 1942, 1943, because this is again an ethnically mixed region, partly Polish Catholic, partly Ukrainian Orthodox, and with a considerable Jewish population as well. And as soon as 1943, during the war, Ukrainian militias tried to ethnically cleanse that region and to expel Poles from those villages into the west, into kind of deeper Poland. And those Ukrainian militias, who belonged to an Ukrainian nationalistic organization, the UPA, were not overly supported by the Germans, but they, especially in the constellation of 1943, enjoyed German benevolence and acceptance. So they started targeting those Polish villages, and once the Polish villages got attacked by Ukrainian militiamen, quite naturally a coalition or an alliance got formed between those Jews who were still alive in that region and the Polish village people. And so I have five survivor testimonies from that little village alone are part of the VHA that tell us about the dynamics of that inter-Polish civil war or Polish-Ukrainian civil war. So these survivors recollect that there was like a Jewish group in that area that made a deal or collaborated with some Soviet parachutists who also stranded there in 1943, as well as with that Polish village, which was kind of under siege by Ukrainian nationalists. And that all happened in the winter of 1943-44. And they then decided to all move into that village and to turn it into a fortress, and also in order to find food and shelter. So the coalition there was that the village people were of course interested in kind of strengthening their defense ability against those Ukrainian militias, which were extremely hostile towards the Poles. And it was in a way, the village was indeed under siege for a good part of the winter, and the village started to in a way put up some defense lines. They would agree on changing roles between the defenders. So the fighters were hiding during daytime. The Jewish non-fighters were helping out in the Polish households. And at night, Jews, Poles, and Soviets would jointly dig trenches around the village. And when the Ukrainian guerrilla finally attacked, the first charge could be repulsed by this multi-ethnic force. And only when later on in the spring of 1944 German tanks appeared, and that's the first time Germans in a way feature in these testimonies, the village was then finally abandoned and destroyed, and most of the inhabitants managed to flee into the forests, with some were massacred in the village of Hanachuvka. So this is the burial site of the murder victims, who again were killed, most of them not by the German tanks that had appeared, but by those Ukrainian militiamen. So this, of course, is just one example how local case studies can help us to understand the dynamics on the ground and the conflicts that are fought within those non-German societies in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And I think it's also a great testimony, a great example why, and this is my second last point here, why Jewish testimonies enable us to understand those dynamics. First of all, because they have been collected, and Jews form a very important part of those local stories here. We would not know much about the fight or the battle for Hanachuvka in the spring of 1944 if it wasn't for those survivors. Of course, Polish archives have collected testimonies as well, and there is a great collection of Polish partisan fighters, whether they fought in the Armia Krajowa or within other formations. So this is not Jewish sources are not the only source, and the picture would be incomplete if we rely on Holocaust testimonies alone, but they shed important light on those events, and they are, I would argue, better accessible at this point. Secondly, Jews who come from these regions and who come from these societies do know exactly with whom they are dealing with. So they know their former neighbors, they know the local nationalists, and they know their agendas, they know to what extent they can trust them, and they also know very well when things start to change. And there was no trust towards their Polish neighbors in the village of Hanachówka in 1941 or in 1942. That only started changing gradually when the Ukrainian attacks on the village started, of course. And this is, I think, an important point. And especially, and if we look back at the initial picture of the non-German perpetrator, the Jewish victim, they also, in a way, know about the dynamic between the German and the non-German perpetrator, and have developed a certain feeling for that dynamic. And on the other hand, the Germans know their non-German partners to a much worse extent. So often, in a way, the Germans are indeed lost in translation here, or do not really understand the dynamic that is shaped very often by local factors. And this is, by the way, Leopold Kozlowski, who is one of the voices of the VHA and from that village of Hanachówka, and who is also quite a famous jazz musician in Poland. So let me wrap up by just mentioning how I think this kind of research will help to shape our picture of the Holocaust and contribute to our knowledge about those events. I think it's first of all very important because it will help us to, or help me to Europeanize the history of the Holocaust by, again, moving away from the prevailing perspective through the lens of the Germans, and by shedding light, or by looking into those countries where so much of the Holocaust was actually happening, whether it's Romania, or whether it's Bulgaria, or whether it's Croatia, or whether it's Eastern Poland. Secondly, of course, this goes beyond the important claim of Saul Friedlander that we need to discuss, or we need to explore the Holocaust from both the perpetrators and the victims' perspectives. And this also goes beyond Raoul Hilberg's interest in bystanders, actually a term or a concept that does not really feature in my research, because the notion of bystanding does not explain much, nor can we actually see real bystanding, because those local forces that are involved in the processes are always a very important part of the picture. And that also will help me to internationalize the history of the Holocaust even further by highlighting those non-German agendas and their interests, by asking why do these perpetrators actually partake in that project that is sold to them as the solution of the Jewish question in Europe. But each and every country sees their contribution, the reasons for their contribution, in something different. And also they define the question, what is a Jew, who are the Jews, what's Jewish, differently than the German. So this will add a number of other facets. Finally, I think once we look at the Southeastern European states and the point in time when they start failing or being challenged, or when they start realizing that the war is getting lost for them, I think this will also open our minds to the variety of timelines of the Holocaust, which is not only one, in a way, genocidal dynamic that unleashes in 38, 39 and then comes to an end in 45, but the timeline of each and every of these countries is a different one. For instance, the Romanian case, where mass violence starts in 1940, but when the state, as long as it's able to act, kind of tries to abort the Holocaust in 1943. So the Romanian government, in a way, puts a halt to the mass killings of Jews in 1943. And that's actually a little bit less than 1 year earlier when the Holocaust in Hungary starts. So 8 months after that decision, the Hungarian government, and here, of course, led or guided by the Germans, starts its genocide of the Jews. And it's not a coincidence, because Hungary and Romania are probably the two countries that were the hardest to control in their mutual competition. So actually the Germans, as well as the Italians as overseeing powers, had a hard time to keep those two countries at peace. So the Hungarian-Romanian conflict was a considerable one during the Second World War. So the question of timing is, I think, a very, very important one. And that leads me to a final point, and that's the question, when does violence actually start? So why do certain countries start with genocidal violence at a certain point in time? Of course, we can sometimes answer that question because, for instance, the war starts, or German armies enter a certain country, or a conflict breaks out. But sometimes that question is much harder to answer. Why does violence erupt or start at a certain point in time, especially if we study the eruption of violence on a regional or on a local level? And that goes as well for the important question, when and how does violence end? And here the timeline is, of course, indeed complicated, because in some of the countries the Holocaust stops as early as in 1943. In other countries and that's the Holocaust more like as a state-sponsored crime, where the state decides to stop deportations, and in other societies where civil wars have broken out, the end of the war or the end of the Second World War does not mean automatically the end of local of the dynamics of violence on the ground. So if we look at the cases of the Ukrainian-Polish Civil War, if we look at the civil war in Yugoslavia during the Second World War, and also if we look at the civil war in Greece, those conflicts do not end in 1945, but fighting continues well into the year 1946. And that applies as well for that of course affects those Jews who are still alive or who are still in the area as well. So the attacks on Jews who return to their villages in eastern Poland, for instance, and who come to those villages in order to find out whether if relatives of theirs are still alive or not, are of course in a way part of those ongoing conflicts in those areas. And again, the armies dominating the military field, the victorious armies, in that case the Soviets, are not necessarily present on the ground. And this, of course, explains to a large deal why local killings of Jews do not automatically stop in 1944-45. With liberation, of course, we are, however, talking about killings on a much smaller scale than before the official end of the war. And so the question, how does violence in regions affected by a civil war comes to an rest, and when do those militias actually declare themselves as defeated or disband themselves, or are militarily crushed, is an important one. And it's certainly not May 1945, but that date differs from country to country and from region to region. I'll leave it here, and I look forward to hearing your questions and to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Somebody?
Well, I have a question. I've always assumed that the Ukrainians were under the Soviets. Is that not true, or were these a fragile militia?
Yes, of course, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union until 1941, until the German attack. However, there was a considerable Ukrainian minority in the Polish state as well. So.
Oh, they were living in Poland. Okay.
But in 1941, after the German attack, Ukrainian independent movement starts becoming active. The so-called Bandera movement, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, OUN, under the leader Bandera, and they try to use the war to form an independent Croatian state, Ukrainian state. Sorry. That, however, is not successful, and some of the Ukrainian leaders are being arrested and even sent to German concentration camps, to Sachsenhausen.
Arrested by who?
By the Germans. Because they are in a way a very unreliable, somehow dangerous ally, and the Germans, of course, don't want to see an independent Ukrainian state. On the other hand, Ukrainian militias are the only force on the ground that is willing to work with the Germans. So it's a very complicated relationship, and as so many other nationalistic movements, they want to achieve ethnic homogeneity, so they are in a way interested in decreasing the number of Poles and Jews within the territory they control. They are very anti-Soviet, so they kind of find themselves in an alliance with the Germans that no one really wants, but they are kind of the natural allies in 1941 in a very complicated relationship.
My geography is not as good as it should be. So how do the borders of Croatia in 1940 compare to like Croatia today?
I think the most important point here is that Croatia includes Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is today an independent state. And in 1941, that territory is also awarded or included into the Croatian state. In other words, there's a considerable Muslim population that is or becomes part of the Croatian state, and Croatian nationalists have always claimed that the Bosnian Muslims are Croatian by ethnicity. So they say that the Croatian nation consists of Croats who are Catholic and who are Muslim by religion. And so they indeed managed to create this greater Croatian state during the Second World War. But this is only a greater Croatian state on the map, because on the ground those territories are not always controlled by the here you have it, it's this part here. It's not always controlled by the Croatian government, but again by all kinds of militias, whether it's the communist partisans, whether it's Muslim militias, who in a way try to defend their villages, or whether it's the Italian army that marches into the country in the summer of 1941.
And then I'm wondering if you see any like continuity between this kind of blood and soil nationalism, you know, particularly in Croatia and the Balkans, with what then we then saw in the 1990s. I mean, my interest here is trying to figure out how much of this is German insanity, what I consider insanity, and how much of this is indigenous fanaticism.
So the Germans don't want a civil war in that country. So they want to reshape the borders, and I think the German take is incredibly naive in 1941 because they think we can, in a way, achieve or allow them to achieve ethnic homogeneity during the war. But they think that this is going to take the form of population transfers, or that peaceful ethnic cleansing under wartime conditions is possible.
Like 100,000 Serbs here, 100,000 Croats here.
Exactly, and this is actually a conversation between Hitler and the Croatian head of state, Ante Pavelić, in the summer of 1941, when Hitler gives permission to deport 250,000 Serbs. The effect, of course, is a local civil war, and the effect is that the situation is getting totally out of control from a German point of view. So local militias start deporting people, communist partisans start striking back, arming themselves, the village people join the partisans, whether they are communists or not, and this creates a huge resistance movement, as well as this local civil war I was talking about. And but this is not something the Germans wanted. They basically wanted to control the region, and then they tried to stop that civil war, unsuccessfully though, because they don't really have the means to stop that civil war. So the Germans, in a way, fuel that situation and allow it to happen, but the agendas are local. It's local nationalists who are acting on the ground and who try to achieve what they really want. So, as you asked whether it's German or local insanity, it's both, but it's local agendas.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about getting at the private agendas. So you talked about some of the sort of larger nationalist agendas of non-German perpetrators. And you said you were interested in also investigating private agendas. And I'm just curious methodologically how you're going to set about doing that, from where and who can these private agendas be revealed?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so first of all, I think this is where Jewish testimonies again become important, because often it was a very intimate relation of whether of direct persecution, or whether it was in a way very tense relations between Jews and individuals representing those societies surrounding them. But here, Jewish perspectives offer a view into more private, or more personal, I should say, relationships. And secondly, I think where things become more personal, it's largely about property, or the question of property, of looting, of settling economic scores is mostly intertwined with what we normally understand as in a way private conflict, and often, of course, the private private or political conflicts have been in a way used to or have in a way covered economic relations or economic conflicts. So there again, apart from Jewish testimonies who allow us to understand those relationships better, it's, well, the sheer economic question: who benefits from the deportation of Jews on a local level, or Serbs? Again, it's not only Jews who have to leave certain locations and whose property is in a way up for grabs in those villages. I should add, however, that not all of that is personal, and not all of that is in a way motivated by greed and the opportunity to enrich oneself. And again, I think in those agricultural societies, once the social balance of a village changed, in a way everybody got involved, and it's the sheer fact that someone has had to take care of the harvest or of the cattle in those villages. So in a way, peasants also quite naturally stepped in once a certain part of the population was deported, whether they were anti-Semites or not, or whether they disliked their Serbian neighbors or not. This was more like the local economy that got affected by those deportations.
So two pretty separate questions. One, I'm wondering if when you're presenting your scholarship, you've ever come across accusations of relativizing the suffering of one group versus another. Because, when I just heard, oh yeah, we also have to consider that Jews were not the only ones who were forced to move. So I'm just wondering if you've gotten pushback on that. And then the other question sort of comes out of my own research, which focuses on concentration camps. Would you say it's a worthwhile exercise to map your schema onto what went on in the concentration camps? In terms of sort of strategizing, playing one group, national group off another, or not even by nation, but let's say by triangle color.
Thanks for two very interesting questions. I'll start with the second one. I think, of course, it's way more tricky to kind of study such or to use such an approach for concentration camps, because it's way more individualized, and it's people who are deprived of their liberty and are of course under daily attack for their lives. And then to talk about victim competition is a bit tricky, but of course we all know that victim competition and the privileging of some groups against others was very common in concentration camps. And I think this research, of course, has well started. I think the downside is that we sometimes, driven by our methods or driven by our research ideas, there's the risk that we lose kind of our sensibilities, or that we in a way start forgetting. Well, we don't really start forgetting how life-threatening the situation in the concentration camps was for most of the groups. But I think one has to try to take a step back from time to time from your own research methods. As for your first question, yes, indeed, I have been accused of downplaying violence and actually quite intensively, and so my book sparked a debate in Serbia, and there was a campaign run by Serbian nationalistic historians against my book and my research, accusing me of minimizing the genocide of the Serbs during the Second World War, which is ironic because actually the genocide of the Serbs was my main interest in my book on Croatia during the Second World War. I argued how much the violence against the Serbs shaped the Holocaust in that country, and I tried to bring some attention to those crimes. The reason why I was under attack, or my research was under attack, was that I wasn't really using the term genocide. I was speaking kind of more openly of mass violence, and I was making that point that it is a civil war within the society that is taking place. And if you use the term or the concept of civil war, that kind of implies that each party is somehow involved, which clearly was the case. But from a Serb nationalistic point of view, I turned victims of a genocide into a party that partakes in the civil war. Of course, if you read the book, you see that this is not what I was trying to say. But I think the shift from victimhood to agency was something that was not appreciated. And then the victim numbers, of course, which are incredibly exaggerated still in the Serbian case. So many Serbian historians never tried to come up with realistic figures. So they are still using the figures used in communist Yugoslavia up until the 1980s, and which are exaggerated. And I think the reason why research in Serbia hasn't moved forward in comparison to other countries, in comparison to, say, Poland or Czechoslovakia, where, of course, after 1990, research made huge leaps, are the wars of the 1990s. They kind of have caused a nationalistic blockade, which still prevents the appreciation of research.
Thanks. If I may piggyback a question, how useful is the concept of genocide to your work? Do you bring in the term? Do you try to avoid it? Because you just said you turn to concepts of mass violence and civil war. Does genocide give you something else, or is it too risky that it's just playing with fire? Leave it alone.
Yeah, so I'm flip-flopping here, and I had a journey of forth and back. So when I did my when I wrote my PhD, I was in a way very concerned and came to the conclusion that the term genocide is actually not representing my approach. So I tried to avoid the term and came up with that concept of mass violence, which I defined in my book, and which I used meticulously, kind of trying to avoid that term, which didn't pay off, however, because the term is being used by everybody, and it's such an important part of our language if we talk about groups of perpetrators targeting and killing innocent people. So we simply can't work around the term, and that was what I realized, partly thanks to those Serbian nationalists who attacked my book, that it's not really possible to not use the term. So I kind of arrived at the common sense use of the term genocide, which then I can specify once I'm talking about it or using it in writing. But I think we do share kind of a common sense use of the word, which allows us to use it in a sensible way.
One would hope.
One would hope.
I have an awkward question, and I don't know if there's any way to measure it or if there's any way to know it, but like, how popular was this blood and soil nationalism in the abstract? And then how popular was it when it was translated into concrete acts of genocide? And is there any way to know that?
Okay, so I try to answer that relatively broad question, but in terms of popularity, I think the idea that Eastern European states would somehow become something like France or Germany, so that they would become modern nation states with clear boundaries and with some kind of ethnic homogeneity, I think that was a greatly popular idea. And it was because it was connected with ideas of modernity, of arriving in Europe, of becoming part of the European family. So these ideas were intertwined with the discourse of becoming modern, arriving, getting there.
Okay.
This is why they were partly so popular. So we become independent, we become a nation state. In order to become a nation state, a modern nation state, ethnic homogeneity has to heal, it has to go.
Okay.
So I think this about the popularity.
And does this come from like the ideas of like Treaty of Versailles, or is this like something
Yes,
that is...
indeed. I think Woodrow Wilson, with the promise to grant European peoples sovereignty, kind of planted, of course, an existing idea already, but the Treaty of Versailles did great damage. Or actually, well, Wilson made a promise on which he could not deliver, and then the Versailles Treaty was, of course, a peace system that was not based on ethnic homogeneity, because it was not possible, but the idea was out, and so it was basically Hitler who then started delivering on Wilson's promise by saying, I'm the one who really creates ethnic homogeneity in your countries. And this is one of the reasons why Hitler was such a popular statesman in many of the countries I was mentioning today.
So the idea of, you know, each people having their own territory and becoming modern and as a nation state, this is widely supported in the abstract. And then, like, is there when is there like a shriek back, or is there a pullback when the consequences of that are, okay, we got to get trains to transfer population and start, you know, cleaning up the neighborhood and purifying the place?
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course there is, because genocide is extremely nasty and violent business, and of course many people kind of get dragged into it, whether voluntarily or whether unconsciously. So many people kind of are dragged into that, but at the end of the day, I think most of those affected came to realize that this is not only bad for the society as such, but also it is bad for them. So one example is, of course, the ethnic homogenization of villages sparked counterattacks, and whether you liked it or not, if you belonged to a certain ethnic group, so for instance Croats who were on the winning side in 1941, they found themselves under attack by those Serb militias who got created in response to the initial attack. So often Croats, whether they liked it or not, had then to side with their fascist government, again whether they liked it or not, because they were being attacked as representatives of that very state. So the ethnic boundaries within those genocidal societies soon became a question of death or life, and of personal safety. However, as on the ground, individuals came to realize that this is not a good future. This is not the society in which they want to live.
Right.
Plus, it doesn't lead anywhere, because you can't just kill a third of the population. And this is one of the reasons why the communist partisans became so incredibly successful in the Yugoslav region, because they were the only ones who then again started to offer a supra-ethnic alternative, who became successful because they gave the promise, well, actually there is a post-genocidal future, and we do not need to kill each other. We will have a Yugoslav state based on brotherhood and unity, and that's the reason why people ran to the partisans in Dresden, not because they were communists. It's just a tiny minority of those peasant supporters of the partisans were in favor of communism.
And was Tito pretty much the only one? I mean, in what became Yugoslavia, was a similar movement in Eastern Europe, in like Ukraine, or with Poles and Ukrainians, or?
That's a very good question, and the reason is basically no. There was no strong supra-ethnic partisan movement in the rest of Eastern Europe. Of course, Jews and to some extent Poles, if they were communists, would join the Soviet partisans, or in Slovakia there was a partisan uprising as well, which kind of opened its ranks or to members of other ethnic groups. But by and large, Yugoslavia is the only success story, and it's also the most successful partisan movement there is. Belgrade was the only European capital that was self-liberated during the Second World War. There was no other major city that was liberated by partisans, that was liberated by an army that came from that country. One might argue that de Gaulle liberated Paris, but
not really.
Yeah, not really. So in that respect, Yugoslavia is a remarkable exception of that rule. It's a remarkable success.
I have a question, if I may. You mentioned in your talk, or you used the concept of the coalition of perpetrators from Kistendala, and then you said so they shared certain goals, but the motivations were quite different. Can you elaborate a little bit on this? Give us maybe an example where these different perpetrators, where they shared goals and where they have different motivations.
So I'll give you another example again from the Yugoslav context, where we have a large coalition of violent perpetrators, which however is extremely fragile, and it breaks apart more often than it actually sticks together. So we have German armies and the German occupation regime. We have the Italians, who also are interested in a way turning Yugoslavia into a fascist space that is in a way that is in line with the Italian war goals. We have those Croatian militias who want to ethnically homogenize Croatia. And finally, as mentioned before, we have the Bosnian population, the Muslim population of Yugoslavia, who again form their own local leadership, including militias. So we have 4 different groups, in theory, fighting for the new European order. And I think this coalition, in a way, allows violence to unleash on the ground. It allows those ethnic cleansings and to some extent the Holocaust as a local history to get started. But once we start studying the motivations of those groups, they actually don't have much in common. The Germans want to achieve entirely different things than the Croatians. The Italians drop out of that coalition as soon as possible. And what it emerges into is then a proxy war. So basically the Germans and the Italians are competing on the ground, and they are supporting different militias. The Italians start supporting Serb nationalists, whereas the Germans keep on supporting Croatian nationalists, which then, armed by weapons from their respective partners, start to fight against each other. So it's a very frail coalition. And interestingly, the breakup of that coalition causes even more violence because a proxy war emerges. And and it's one of the bloodiest conflicts of wartime Europe. Of course, one can kind of keep on breaking that down to a more local level.
You had a
I
question.
have a question. First of all, before I ask my question, this is an aside with regard to the issue of genocide, the term being used to describe different situations. I attended a seminar at UCLA this week. It was on international human rights violations, and they particularly focused in on Armenia, and that was what the discussion was all about. Because, of course, we all know that the Armenian situation was a genocide, and yet the Turks refused to acknowledge it. And I think what they use is what you were saying. It's a civil war. They see it as a civil war. But my question is, back to the Ukraine. My father was born in Berdichev, and to the best of my knowledge, the Nazis moved in there in June of 1941, and they used it as like a rehearsal for Baba Yar, which was to come in the near future. And I was wondering, in all your studies and research and all, I was wondering if you ever did any research on Berdichev, because I know it was a very well-known little town. It was known as the Jerusalem of Ukraine, and the Nazis had a particular interest in it because of that.
Yeah, thanks for your comment on Armenia, and I'm of course well aware that Turkish lobbyists try to use that notion of civil war in a way to detract attention from the Armenian genocide. Yet one has to be aware or to be cautious not to downplay Armenian agency, and of course we do talk about armed Armenian forces and militias. So I think I'm still sympathetic of the concept of a civil war, even though it's very often intertwined with the genocide. So I think we have to truly study the dynamics between two groups. So I think the Armenian camp, if you will, is not entirely innocent of, in a way, trying to push or to create a more dichotomy of perpetrators and victims on the one hand, which doesn't help us to understand what's going on either, aside from in a way moral, from our moral standards, that it's of course wrong to attack and kill innocent people. That goes without saying. As for Berdichev, I have not studied it in detail, but my colleague Michaela Christ has published a book on the massacre in German not too long ago. What's interesting, however, about this massacre is again this transnational dimension, because Hungarians do play an important part in the events in 1941, because thousands of Jewish refugees from the Ukraine got stranded in a part of the Ukraine which is occupied by the Hungarian army in 1941, and they push all those refugees back into the German zone of occupation, which then accelerates the German decision, which radicalizes the German take, and in a way is important if we study the decision-making process on the German side. It's an important milestone on their decision to kill the local Jews, many of which are actually refugees that got uprooted by war and occupation. So again, traditionally we study that as the story of Germans marching in, having in mind that they want to kill the Jews, and that one day they start doing it. The reality and the detail is more complicated, and this is why the Hungarian case is important here. So this is something I would also have to bear in mind here.
My husband and I went to Berdichev, and we went to what they call Brodsky Street, where the mass graves are there in a field. And it was a pretty remarkable experience. just to see where all this happened. And of course, when my father was raised till he was 12 years old.
Were there any trials after the war? And if there were are you able to get any of the transcripts to gain information as to what happened?
Yes, the transcripts are pretty much accessible throughout Eastern Europe, but they were by and large Stalinist propaganda trials that served certain purposes. So if we want to find out what happened on the ground, most of these trial transcripts do not help us very much, because the perpetrators are demonized in certain ways. It's only a small portion of the perpetrators who stood trial, again for reasons that did not necessarily or don't have necessarily to do with the fact what they did or what they did not do, but rather who they were and whether they were a target for the new communist regimes or not. So I'm extremely distrustful of the trial records as sources regarding what happened during the wartime, but they are extremely important sources that tell us how the society is being reshaped in 1945, 46, 47. So they teach us a lot about the communist takeover after the war, but less about the Holocaust as such.
There was a person in Los Angeles by the name of Artukovic. He was extradited. Where was he sent back to? And
to Yugoslavia. That was in the late 1980s. He was the interior minister of the independent state of Croatia, and indeed he was one of the key responsibles for the Holocaust in Croatia. And I talked to his son a couple of years ago, Rata Tukovic, who in a way still tries to whitewash the history of his.
Yeah, he loves his father.
He loves his father. Who doesn't? However, again, this man, a high-ranking perpetrator, was demonized by the Yugoslav state in such a stark way that it's really impossible to look behind the picture of demonization if we look only at the court trial. So he was presented to or told to be the Himmler of Croatia, the mastermind of the Holocaust in Croatia, which is not true. He was a powerful politician with an agenda, not more, not less. So
should people be demonized if they're kind of like pushing genocide?
Well, I'm a historian. I don't demonize. I want to, and plus I don't believe in demons anyway. So I think the percentage of pathological killers amongst the perpetrators is a tiny one. It's about 1 to 5%, but not more. So those who are driven by hatred and by sadistic feelings.
But I mean, isn't it? I mean, in a way, if you're driven by utopian nationalism and it has a, brutal genocidal consequences, how much less demonic is that?
Well, but the demonic part about that is that it's in a way part of human modernity, so it's much closer to us than we would want to acknowledge, whereas like the evil and bad demon serves us as an excuse. We would never ever be at risk in partaking in a genocide. So I think the utopian demon who promises a better, more stable, more just society through genocide, or more pure, is actually much closer to us, and therefore it's more dangerous, more challenging, more disturbing, and more important to study, I guess.
I think this was a very good closing remark. Thank you very much.